Joe Exotic's wild story took an unexpected turn when he married fellow inmate Jorge Marquez behind bars. But just days later, their new beginning was shattered when the government stepped in and tore them apart. Joe said, "They took everything, but I won't give up." What really happened behind the prison walls? Let's dive into the shocking truth. Inside the concrete walls of the Federal Medical Center in Fort Worth, Texas, a love story began. One so unlikely, it feels almost scripted. Joe Exotic, once the wild and controversial star Tiger King, was serving a long sentence when he met someone who would change his life yet again. That someone was Jorge Marquez, a 33-year-old fellow inmate with a complicated past and a surprising connection to Joe that no one saw coming. Joe, now 62, wasn't exactly looking for love behind bars. His life had already been a chaotic ride, from running a controversial zoo to becoming an overnight Netflix sensation, to then facing serious charges that landed him in prison. But even in a place built to break spirits, Joe found someone who brought a sense of peace he hadn't felt in years. Jorge, more than 2 decades younger, came from a very different world. He had been incarcerated for re-entering the U.S. without permission and for his involvement in transporting undocumented individuals across the border. Despite their different backgrounds and reasons for being locked up, something clicked between the two. Joe would later describe Jorge not just as his partner, but as the one person who truly stood by him during his lowest points, especially while he battled cancer in prison. The connection grew over time, fueled by shared struggles, late-night talks, and the kind of emotional support rarely found behind bars. Jorge, Joe said, wasn't just a comfort, he was a lifeline. After everything Joe had been through, public ridicule, health scare, betrayal, this relationship felt like a rare second chance. When Joe announced their relationship to the outside world, it took fans by surprise. He posted messages declaring his love for Jorge, sharing hopes of starting a new life together outside prison walls. In his usual larger-than-life style, Joe didn't hold back, saying he wished they'd met years earlier and calling Jorge the reason he made it through his toughest battles. Their decision to get married behind bars raised eyebrows, not just because of who they were, but because of how quickly and deeply they seemed to connect. The ceremony itself was simple but meaningful. No big celebrations, no fancy suits, but a pair of matching tattooed wedding bands made the union feel real in a way that resonated with both of them. Even with limited freedom, they made a promise to be each other's anchor in a place designed to make you feel alone. But this moment of happiness wouldn't last long. Only weeks after the wedding, their world would be turned upside down. What happened next didn't just test their bond, it threatened to tear it apart entirely. And what happened next would spark outrage, confusion, and a desperate plea from Joe Exotic that would echo far beyond prison walls. Before his name was ever linked to Joe Exotic, Jorge Marquez lived a life filled with hardship, risk, and quiet resilience. Born in Mexico, Jorge didn't grow up with luxury or fame. His life was shaped by survival, by the constant push to find something better, even if it meant breaking rules along the way. And for many like him, that road eventually led across the U.S. border. Jorge first entered the United States illegally, likely in search of opportunity, something more stable than what he left behind. But the journey wasn't easy, and his story took several dark turns. After being deported once, he returned again, determined to stay, but found himself on the wrong side of the law when he got involved in transporting undocumented migrants. Whether he was doing it for money, out of desperation, or under someone else's influence, the courts didn't see much gray area. He was caught, charged, and sentenced to prison time in the U.S. He wasn't a headline name. Unlike Joe, Jorge didn't have cameras following him or a documentary crew chronicling his life. But inside prison, Jorge's story took on a new chapter. He kept mostly to himself, quiet, serious, and cautious. That's part of what drew Joe in. Jorge wasn't looking for attention. He wasn't trying to be part of a scandal or ride anyone's coattails. And maybe that's why Joe, surrounded by noise for most of his life, found peace in Jorge. In the close quarters of prison life, personalities either clash or connect. Jorge, with his reserved nature, offered something Joe hadn't had in years. Someone who listened without judgment. Someone who didn't care about the fame or the headlines. Just a man beneath it all. Joe would later say that Jorge had been there for him when no one else was. Through the cancer treatments, the legal nightmares, and the isolation, Jorge was the one person he could count on. Despite the 29-year age gap, their relationship grew quickly. They shared stories, meals, quiet moments that don't make headlines but build trust. For Jorge, who had lived a life in the shadows, the relationship gave him something new: visibility, and maybe even a chance to be seen as more than his record. For Joe, it meant healing, support, and yes, love. Jorge's background added a layer of controversy to their relationship. To some, it was a tale of redemption. To others, it raised questions. Was this a genuine bond or something more transactional? But behind those speculations was a very real truth. Two people, broken in different ways, found comfort in each other inside a system built to keep them apart. But that fragile connection would soon be tested, just as they were settling into the reality of being a married couple. Even behind bars, a storm was brewing, because Jorge's past, the very history that brought him to Joe, was about to come crashing back into their lives in a way neither of them expected. In most weddings, the ceremony is the beginning of something new, a fresh chapter, full of hope. For Joe Exotic and Jorge Marquez, their wedding wasn't held in a chapel or a garden. It happened in a prison. No tuxedos, no guests, no champagne, just two inmates, a few government forms, and a quiet promise made in the middle of chaos. Still, for Joe, it was one of the proudest days of his life. The ceremony took place in April 2025 inside the Federal Medical Center in Fort Worth, Texas. Joe had already spent years behind bars at that point, serving a 21-year sentence. His fame had faded in some circles, but remained burning hot in others, especially among his most loyal followers. He'd been through failed relationships, legal nightmares, public humiliation, and serious health battles. But here he was, about to make a commitment to someone he said gave him a reason to keep fighting. The wedding wasn't glamorous, but it was emotional. Without family, without fanfare, Joe and Jorge stood across from each other in one of the few private moments the prison allowed. No cameras, no viral clips, just two men, stripped of all distractions, choosing each other in a place where trust is hard to come by. What made the moment even more symbolic were the wedding rings, or rather, the lack of them. Instead of gold bands, they opted for something far more permanent: tattoos. On their ring fingers, they inked symbols of their bond. Joe later shared that the tattoos represented strength, survival, and the fact that their love had formed in one of the harshest places on earth. The message was clear. This wasn't a fling or a publicity stunt. It meant something. Outside the prison walls, the news exploded. Social media lit up with reactions, some shocked, others skeptical, and many simply stunned that Joe Exotic was once again dominating headlines. Fans weighed in, some celebrating the union, others questioning whether it was real love or just another twist in Joe's ever-dramatic life story. But to Joe, the noise didn't matter. He made it clear through his online posts. This wasn't about followers or fame. This was about Jorge. He called him his rock, saying Jorge had stood by him when no one else did. While battling cancer, dealing with betrayals from former allies, and watching his old world crumble, Joe said Jorge was the only one who stayed. In his words, the wedding wasn't just a celebration. It was a lifeline. And yet, even on that day, there was a shadow hanging over them. Jorge's legal status remained fragile. He was set to be released soon, but IC, Immigration and Customs Enforcement, was circling. Joe feared that the man he had just married might be ripped away before they could spend even one day together outside prison walls. As they exchanged their vows, that uncertainty loomed. But in that moment, they weren't inmates. They were simply two people, bruised, beaten, but still believing in something worth holding on to. Unfortunately for them, the celebration was short-lived, because just days after the wedding, Joe would wake up to devastating news. And what happened next would not only break his heart, but ignite a public firestorm that would bring him back into the headlines once again. Just days after Joe and Jorge said, "I do behind bars," everything unraveled. Joe woke up expecting another routine day in prison, mundane but manageable. Instead, he got the gut punch he'd been dreading for months. Jorge was gone. No warning, no goodbyes, no final kiss through plexiglass. Immigration and Customs Enforcement had moved fast, too fast. Jorge had been scheduled for an immigration hearing, one that could have given him a chance to fight for asylum or at least delay his deportation. But instead, without the ceremony or structured due process, he was swept away in the middle of the night and put on a plane back to Mexico. No lawyer, no notice, no husband at his side. Joe was furious and heartbroken. For a man known for his over-the-top antics and showboating personality, his response this time was raw, almost restrained. He turned to social media not for attention, but for help. In a public post, Joe described what happened, claiming Jorge had been illegally deported before ever seeing a judge. He said it wasn't just a betrayal of justice. It was a personal ambush. Joe begged for support. "Help me bring him home," he wrote. To him, this wasn't just another chapter in the media circus that had followed him since Tiger King hit screens in 2020. This was the man he loved. And now, he was gone, snatched away without warning, sent to a country Jorge hadn't called home in years, with no resources and no protection. The timing of it all felt cruel. After years of turmoil, Joe had found something steady, something real. And just as he let himself believe in a future, something to hold on to, it was taken from him in the most abrupt way possible. The prison system had let them marry. It had acknowledged their union. But then, another arm of the government stepped in and erased that possibility overnight. The internet reaction was mixed. Some rallied behind Joe, calling out the immigration system for its cold and calculated methods. Others were skeptical, wondering if this was just another Joe Exotic publicity stunt. But behind the noise was a simple truth. This wasn't about a TV show or viral fame anymore. This was about two people being pulled apart by a system neither of them could control. Joe didn't just lose a husband that day. He lost the only person who had stood by him during his cancer treatments, the only one who believed in him when most had walked away. And for Jorge, the return to Mexico wasn't a homecoming. It was exile. But Joe wasn't done. Heartbroken or not, he still had fight left in him. And as he sat alone in his prison cell, stewing in a mixture of grief and rage, he started plotting his next move, a move that could shake up not just his own future, but the legal and immigration systems themselves. Joe Exotic has never been one to go quietly, and this time it was personal. After Jorge's sudden deportation, Joe's heartbreak turned into fire. He didn't just grieve, he activated. Within days, he was back on social media, not for clout or controversy, but to launch a very public, very emotional campaign to bring his husband back. His messages were direct, raw, and filled with frustration. He accused the government of tearing apart a legal marriage, of treating Jorge like a number instead of a human being, and of denying them basic dignity. For a man already known for battling institutions, from animal rights activists to the justice system, this new fight hit different. This wasn't about a zoo or a documentary. This was about love. Joe began calling out IC directly. In post after post, he claimed Jorge was deported without a hearing, without legal representation, and without warning. He described it as a government ambush, saying Jorge had been thrown into the streets of Mexico with nothing but the clothes on his back. Whether every detail was exactly as Joe described it or not, one thing was clear: he was devastated, and he wasn't going to let it go. He began petitioning from behind bars, demanding that Jorge be granted asylum or humanitarian parole. He pushed for legal recognition of their marriage as a reason for Jorge to be allowed back into the U.S. And he didn't stop there. Joe even floated the idea of renouncing his U.S. citizenship if it meant he could join Jorge in Mexico. For all his theatrics, this time Joe seemed serious. And people started listening. His supporters, many of whom had followed him since the Tiger King days, rallied online. Hashtags like #BringJorgeHome began circulating, and small waves of public support grew across social platforms. Even critics began to admit, under all the chaos and controversy, this was a man genuinely trying to be with someone he loved, and he was hitting wall after wall in the process. Still, the path forward wasn't clear. Jorge, now back in Mexico, was stuck in legal limbo. He'd been deported quickly and quietly, without a clear plan or the means to fight for re-entry. For many deportees, the return is final. The U.S. government rarely reverses those decisions, especially for individuals with prior immigration offenses. But Joe wasn't giving up. He reached out to immigration attorneys, started raising money for legal aid, and promised to go all the way to the White House if he had to, whether that meant filing for spousal immigration from behind bars or seeking international advocacy. He was ready to try anything. His message to fans was simple: don't let them erase us. And that message stuck, because behind all the headlines, all the memes, and all the media circus was a man who just wanted to be with his partner. But while Joe fought from the inside, Jorge was facing a whole new battle outside, a battle to survive and maybe one day to return. Because as determined as Joe was, the system they were fighting had one answer for them so far: no. While Joe was trapped behind bars, firing off public pleas and legal challenges, Jorge was suddenly thrust into a reality he hadn't known in years. Freedom, but without direction. Deported to Mexico with no warning, no preparation, and no plan, Jorge's new life began with confusion, isolation, and fear. He was dropped off with little more than his paperwork and whatever he could carry. No support network, no family waiting, and no resources to navigate a country he barely recognized anymore. For Jorge, freedom didn't feel like liberation. It felt like abandonment. He was a man ripped from the only person who had stood by him in his darkest hours, now forced to start over in a place that felt foreign. And things weren't easy. Finding work was almost impossible. His criminal record and deportation status made him a legal outcast in both countries. Housing was unstable. At times, he moved from temporary shelters to rundown apartments, doing odd jobs under the table just to afford food. Every day felt like survival mode. The love story that began behind bars had landed him in a different kind of prison, one without walls, but with just as many limits. Meanwhile, Joe was still fighting. From his prison cell, he wrote letters, filed petitions, and made noise however he could. He spoke about Jorge in interviews, called out IC repeatedly, and claimed the government had violated their rights as a legally married couple. But bureaucracy doesn't move on heartbreak. Joe's letters often went unanswered. His legal requests bounced back with cold-form responses. The marriage they fought to protect started feeling like a ghost. No conjugal visits. No contact beyond the occasional letter. No word on whether Jorge could ever come back. It wasn't just a separation of space. It was a separation of hope. Still, they didn't let go completely. Joe kept Jorge's name in the spotlight. Jorge, for his part, tried to stay strong, sending Joe letters of encouragement, writing about the day they'd finally be together again. For all the chaos in their lives, they kept one thing alive: belief in their bond. But time changes people. Rumors began swirling online. Some questioned whether Jorge had already moved on. Others speculated that Joe might be using the relationship to gain sympathy or political clout. And through it all, both men stayed largely silent on the deeper details. Maybe out of loyalty, maybe out of exhaustion, or maybe because neither of them knew what the future really held. What started as a whirlwind romance behind bars was now a long-distance limbo between two broken systems. Jorge, struggling to survive in Mexico. Joe, buried in legal red tape in Texas. And both clinging to the hope that what they had was more than just a headline. But as the months dragged on, one question kept surfacing, from fans, from critics, and probably from Joe and Jorge themselves. Can love really survive when the whole world is working against it? As time passes, stories fade, but not for Joe Exotic. For him, the headlines never fully disappear. And with Jorge's sudden deportation still fresh in the minds of the supporters, many are left wondering, what comes next for this unlikely love story? Will Joe and Jorge ever be reunited, or has the system already decided their fate? Joe hasn't stopped fighting. Despite the personal toll, the cancer treatments, the aging body, the years lost behind bars, he remains as defiant as ever. He's filed appeals, reached out to pro bono immigration lawyers, and is even exploring international advocacy to try to get Jorge legal reentry into the U.S. And with every passing day, he continues to tell the world, I'm married for love, not headlines. But the obstacles are enormous. Jorge's deportation was a mistake. It was deliberate, part of a broader system that rarely grants second chances to people with his background. And with Joe still serving a long sentence, his ability to act as a legal sponsor or relocate himself is almost non-existent. The very institutions that allowed them to marry are now the ones keeping them apart. Still, Joe hasn't let go of the dream. In recent letters shared with fans, he's written about building a life with Jorge. Maybe not in the U.S., but somewhere else. Somewhere quiet, away from cameras and controversy. A small house, a garden, peace. It sounds almost laughably normal for a man whose life has been anything but that's what makes it believable. After everything, maybe that's all he really wants. And Jorge? He's kept a low profile since his deportation. There have been no interviews, no videos, no public messages beyond what Joe has shared. Some say he's laying low out of fear. Others believe he's trying to rebuild a life off the grid, away from the noise that Joe's name inevitably brings. Whatever the case, his silence speaks volumes about the pain, the pressure, and maybe even the uncertainty of whether this love story can survive in the real world. Critics remain divided. Some still insist a marriage was a stunt, an attempt by Joe to stay relevant. But others point to the consistency of Joe's efforts, the emotion in his posts, and the rawness of his pleas as proof that, at least to him, this was real. And that's where the story stands now. Unfinished, uncertain, and deeply human. Two men, broken by life in different ways, found comfort in each other within the coldest place imaginable. They got married. They were separated. And now, they're left clinging to the hope that love might still be enough. Even when the odds are stacked against them, whether they reunite or not, their story has already forced people to ask uncomfortable questions about justice, immigration, marriage, and what it really means to love someone when the whole world tells you it's impossible. Because in the end, this wasn't just another Joe Exotic spectacle. It was something a lot more rare. Two people trying to hold on to hope, to each other, and to the one thing neither prison walls nor government agencies could fully take away. Not yet. Anyway, thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this story, hit like and subscribe for more. See you next time.